The first thing I learned that morning was that dying is surprisingly bureaucratic. A woman in light blue scrubs stood at the foot of my bed, tapping on a tablet like it had personally offended her. She didn't look at me when she said it. According to her system, Mr. Hale, you're deceased. I waited for the punchline. None arrived. I'm pretty sure I'd remember that, I said. My voice came out dry, like it had spent the night arguing with sandpaper. She finally looked up. Professional smile. The kind people practice in mirrors. The paperwork was activated at 3:17 a.m. Your will. Full execution. I glanced down at myself. Arms still attached. Chest rising. Heart doing its stubborn, rhythmic thing. Well, I said, this is awkward. That's how my day began. Not with a flat line. Not with angels or tunnels of light. With a clerical error and a woman who pronounced me dead while my heart was rudely refusing to cooperate. Later, I would learn that this mistake had set half of California in motion. At the time, all I knew was that my hospital room suddenly felt too small for a man who technically no longer existed. They told me I'd had a cardiac episode. Not dramatic enough to kill me, but theatrical enough to scare the living hell out of my assistants, lawyers, and at least 3 people who had once sworn eternal love while checking my net worth. Somewhere between the ambulance ride and the ICU, a button had been pressed. Or more accurately, a box had been checked. My will didn't wait for confirmation. It never did. I designed it that way. Efficient, ruthless, like me on my better days. On my worst days too. I asked for water. They gave me ice chips, which felt like an insult dressed as kindness. As I let them melt on my tongue, I noticed the room had already changed. Flowers in the corner I didn't recognize. A leather briefcase by the wall that definitely wasn't mine. Someone had been here. Someone who thought I was gone. There's a particular silence that follows wealth. It's not peace. It's expectation. Even unconscious, I could feel it humming in the room, like static before a storm. By noon, the visitors began. The first was my brother, Richard. He entered cautiously, as if afraid I might still be contagious with life. Perhaps. He looked disappointed when he saw my eyes open. Richard has always worn disappointment well. It matches his face. You're awake, he said. Against the odds, I replied. He smiled, then stopped halfway through, recalibrated, and chose concern instead. The lawyers called. There's been a situation. I hear I'm dead. He nodded. Legally speaking, congratulations, I said. You finally outlived me. He didn't laugh. He never does. Humor requires imagination. Behind him came my eldest daughter, Claire. Perfect posture. Perfect hair. She had inherited my discipline and her mother's talent for emotional distance. She hugged me gently, like I was an antique that might crack. I thought I'd miss my chance, she whispered. So did I said. She pulled back, eyes wet but calculating. Claire cries the way accountants do, math accurately, never excessively. Then came the others. A parade of history. A woman who once loved me for my ambition. Another who loved me despite it. A man in his 20s who looked like me before the mirror learned my secrets. 2 grandchildren I had sent checks to instead of birthday cards. Each face carried its own version of me, none of them flattering, all of them familiar. From the hallway, a nurse watched the scene unfold, from her perspective. It looked like a funeral rehearsal where the corpse refused to lie still. By late afternoon, the truth had spread. Phones buzzed. Flights were booked. Old wounds cleared their throats. My will, written years ago with the confidence of a man certain of his own narrative, was being read aloud in offices I wasn't invited to. I had always believed money simplified things. It doesn't. It just turns emotions into negotiations. At some point between the 3rd awkward hug and the 4th forced apology, it hit me. No one was here because I almost died. They were here because I already had, on paper, and papers I knew, had more power than pulse. As the room filled with whispers and restrained joy and poorly hidden panic, my mind wandered somewhere quieter, backward, to a name that hadn't been spoken yet. A woman none of them mentioned. A woman I had erased so cleanly from my official life that even my will pretended she never existed. That was the real mistake. Not the clause. Not the timing. I had cut her out long before my heart ever tried to quit. Lying there, listening to my legacy argue in hushed tones over my still breathing body, I realized something both funny and cruel. I had survived heart failure. What I wasn't sure I could survive was the inventory of love I had left unfinished. And the day wasn't over yet. By the 2nd morning, the hospital had upgraded my status from miracle to liability. This happened shortly after 2 lawyers arrived before breakfast. They stood at the foot of my bed like bookends made of anxiety. One tall and sunburned, the other compact and permanently sweating. I recognized them immediately. I paid them extremely well to worry on my behalf. Good news, the tall one said. You're alive. Bad news, the short one added without missing a beat. Your estate disagrees. I closed my eyes for a moment. Somewhere in my chest, my heart thumped with the confidence of a man who had no idea what it had just caused. They explained it slowly, as if I'd suffered brain damage along with the cardiac episode. Technically, I had been declared incapacitated during transport. A pre-signed protocol activated my will if two conditions were met: cardiac failure and loss of cognitive function. The first had flirted with success. The second, apparently, was a matter of interpretation. The system assumed the worst, the tall one said. I taught it too, I replied. Efficiency isn't forgiving. They exchanged a look. Lawyers do that when they're about to say something that costs money. Assets had been frozen, then partially distributed. Trusts unlocked. Notifications sent. The legal equivalent of fireworks. Rolling it back would take time. Days, at best. Weeks, more likely. So, I said, I'm Schrodinger's billionaire. The short one smiled despite himself. That's not an inaccurate description. After they left, a nurse came in to check my vitals. Her name was Elena. I knew because she wore it on her badge and because she said my name differently than everyone else, softer, like it belonged to a person, not a headline. You have more visitors scheduled today, she said. Do I get a menu? I asked. She smiled. Just a warning. The first surprise came around 10. A woman stood in the doorway hesitant, like the room might reject her. She hadn't aged the way the others had. Time had been kinder to her than I ever was. Margaret. I hadn't said her name aloud in 25 years. I had paid people handsomely not to. She didn't rush to the bed, didn't cry, didn't reach for my hand. She simply looked at me, really looked, as if checking whether I was the same man who had once promised her a future and then scheduled over it. Well, she said, you look terrible. I laughed. It came out rough, but real. You always had impeccable timing. She pulled a chair closer but didn't sit. I heard you were dead. Temporarily, I said. It didn't take. That's a shame, she replied, then winced. That came out wrong. No, I said. It didn't. She told me she'd received a call. Not from a lawyer. From a foundation. A scholarship fund in her name. One I had created quietly years ago, and never mentioned again. It activated with the will. I didn't know it existed, she said. And I didn't know why. I did. I just never had the courage to say it. Before I could respond, the room filled again. Claire returned, this time with her younger brother, Daniel. He leaned against the wall like he'd rather be anywhere else. He inherited my sarcasm and his mother's disappointment. So this is her, Claire said, polite but sharp. Margaret raised an eyebrow. And you are? They're tightened. I watched the women size each other up across decades of absence, connected by a man who had never learned how to finish anything emotional. I'm his daughter, Claire said. Margaret nodded slowly. I was supposed to be his wife. No one spoke after that. Even the machines seemed to quiet down, as if embarrassed. From the hallway, Elena paused. From her perspective, this was no longer a medical case. It was theater. Badly rehearsed, emotionally expensive theater. Daniel broke the silence. So, is he actually dead, or are we just early? Sit down, I said. My voice surprised me. It had authority again. I missed that. They sat. All of them. The living proof of my divided life. I told them the truth, or something close to it, about the will, about the mistake. About how none of this was intentional, except maybe the parts that were. Margaret listened without interrupting. Claire listened like she was already revising her understanding of me. Daniel stared at the floor. You know, Margaret said finally, the irony is almost impressive. Careful, I said. I designed my reputation carefully. You spent your life controlling outcomes, she continued. And the one time you let go, everything comes back at once. She stood. I didn't come for the money. I came because I wanted to see if you'd finally learned something. Have I? I asked. She smiled sadly. You're still breathing. That's a start. When she left, the room felt emptier than it had all day. That evening, alone again, I stared at the ceiling and did something I hadn't done in years. I wondered who I had been if I hadn't been so busy becoming someone else. And somewhere in the building, my will continued to move through offices and accounts like a ghost that refused to believe it was supposed to stop. The third day taught me something important about being rich. People don't wait for permission to grieve you. They improvise. By morning, my room had been relocated. Same hospital, better view, thicker curtains, a sofa that pretended it wasn't a bed for guilt-ridden relatives. Officially, it was for privacy. In reality, it was crowd control. Elena adjusted my forehead and shook her head. You're trending. In what category? I asked. Complicated, she said. With subplots. The lawyers returned. Both of them. This time they brought folders. Thick ones. When lawyers bring folders, someone's childhood is about to be monetized. They explained that reversing the will was possible, but messy. Some funds had already been transferred. Others were in motion, like freight trains with no brakes. Lawsuits were being prepared preemptively, which I admired in a bleak, professional way. You could sign an addendum, the tall one said. Clarify intent. I was unconscious. I replied. My intent was breathing, yes, the short one said gently. But legally, you were very decisive. They left me with a pen and a headache. Around noon, the first stranger arrived. He was maybe 30. Well dressed in a way that suggested effort rather than ease. He stood too straight, hands clasped, eyes restless. I recognized the posture immediately. Oh, pretending to be confidence. My name is Michael, he said. I think you're my father. I blinked. I have a spreadsheet for this, I said. You'll have to be more specific. He smiled, relieved. Humor meant acceptance. My mother is Laura Bennett. You met her in Seattle, late 90s. I remembered the hotel carpet before I remembered her face. That bothered me. He produced documents, DNA tests, emails I barely recalled writing. I had been generous with money, stingy with presents. Well, I said finally, this explains the jawline. He laughed. It was a good sound, and complicated. From the doorway, Claire watched. She didn't enter. She just absorbed the moment like data. Michael didn't ask for money. He asked questions. About my childhood. About mistakes. About whether I ever regretted leaving. Every day, I said. It surprised both of us. Later came Laura herself. Older, sharper, and apologetic. She kissed my cheek and whispered, you look better horizontal. Flattery will get you everywhere, I said. She didn't stay long. She never had. But she looked at me with something close to forgiveness, and that felt undeserved. In the afternoon, the hospital chaplain stopped by. I'm not religious, I told him. I am, he replied cheerfully. We'll call it a compromise. He asked me if I was afraid of dying. No, I said. I'm afraid of surviving incorrectly. He nodded like that made perfect sense. Maybe it did. Between visits, I kept thinking about Margaret, about the way she had said my name, like it still mattered. The scholarship. The life I'd funded from a distance because I couldn't bring myself to re-enter it. That evening, she returned. This time, she said. I read the terms, she said. The foundation. You were very specific. I didn't want room for interpretation. You always hated ambiguity, she said. Unless it protected you. Double quotes fair. She told me about her life. A marriage that lasted. A career built slowly. A happiness that wasn't loud, but real. She had loved me once. She had outgrown me later. I thought if I became indispensable, I said quietly, you'd stay. She shook her head. You became impressive. I needed present. We sat in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. That might have been the cruelest part. From outside the room, Alna watched them through the glass. She'd seen this kind of quiet before. The kind that arrives after all the shouting is done. Margaret stood to leave. They're asking me if I plan to contest anything, she said. The lawyers, and? I asked. She smiled. I already got what I needed. After she left, I signed the addendum. Not because it fixed things. It didn't, but because it was the first document I'd signed in decades that wasn't about control. As night fell, my phone buzzed. Notifications. News articles. Speculation. Billionaire declared dead, then not. Family divided. Fortune in limbo. I turned it face down. For the first time. The numbers didn't interest me. I wondered instead how many people you could lose while technically winning at life. And whether the fourth day would be kinder or just more honest. The fourth day arrived without drama, which should have warned me. No lawyers before breakfast, no surprise children, no women from my past holding emotional receipts, just sunlight. Pale and indifferent, spilling through the curtains like it had better places to be. Elena brought coffee. Real coffee. That alone told me my condition had improved. Careful, I said. Last time I had caffeine, I almost died. She smirked. That was ambition. This is coffee. I liked her. Not romantically. Not in the way that had ruined half my adult life. I liked her because she saw me as a problem to be managed, not a story to be inherited. Mid-morning, a man in a gray suit arrived without announcing himself. No briefcase. No nervous energy. He sat in the chair Margaret had used, crossed his legs, and waited until I acknowledged him. Mr. Hale, he said, I represent a party not listed in your will. That narrows it down to most of the planet. He smiled thinly. This party was intentionally excluded. That got my attention. He slid a single envelope onto the tray table. My handwriting, older, sharper, from a time when I still believed I could plan my way out of regret. I was instructed to deliver this only after your will was activated, he said. Not after your death, after the activation. So you're saying, I said slowly. I planned for this exactness. Yes, he replied, which is either impressive or deeply unhealthy. I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter addressed to myself. Not a legal document. No witnesses. No clauses. Just a few pages of handwriting I barely recognized. You did it again, it began. You waited too long. I swallowed. The letter was dated 10 years earlier, written after Margaret had left the city for good. After I'd convinced myself that silence was maturity, I wrote about fear, about how every relationship felt like a hostile takeover, about how money had become my safest language because it never asked me to be honest. If this letter is being read, it continued, then you are either dead or pretending not to be. Both states suit you. I laughed. It came out bitter, but genuine. Past me had always been a smart bastard. The letter named her, Margaret, explicitly. It admitted what I never had, that I loved her more than I loved control, that I chose control anyway. The man in the gray suit watched me carefully, like a doctor monitoring a risky reaction. What is your role in this? I asked. I manage a private trust, he said, one not connected to your estate. It was designed to transfer only if you were forced to confront your own absence. My absence, from your own life, he clarified. According to the letter, the trust wasn't for Margaret, or Claire, or Michael. It was for something much harder to buy back. Time. Specifically my time. The funds could only be used for one purpose, to remove me from my company, my board positions. My obligations, for 1 full year. No influence, no consulting, no back-channel control, a paid exile. You plan to disappear, the man said, voluntarily. I never followed through. I muttered. No, he agreed. But you left yourself a trap. After he left, I stared at the ceiling again. It was becoming a habit, one I was developing late in life. In the afternoon, Claire returned alone. She looked tired, not emotionally, strategically. They're fighting, she said. Everyone. About everything. I built a competitive environment, I said. It would have been rude not to enjoy it. She didn't smile. I read the datum, she continued. You gave up voting rights. For now, she echoed. Why? I hesitated. Then decided to try something new. I don't trust myself, I said. She studied me like she was meeting someone else wearing my face. That's unsettling. Get used to it. She sat on the edge of the bed. You were never cruel, she said. Just unavailable. I know. I said. That's worse. Later, Elena came to check on me. She noticed the letter on the table. Fan mail, she asked. A warning, I said, from myself. She nodded. Those are usually accurate. As night fell, I signed another document. Not for the lawyers. For the trust. The moment I did, something inside me loosened, not healed. Loosened. I had spent decades designing systems that couldn't fail. Now I was voluntarily stepping into one that required me to. And for the first time since the morning I'd been pronounced dead, I felt strangely, terrifyingly alive. By the 5th day, the hospital stopped pretending I was the main event. My chart was stable. My heart behaved. The machines grew bored with me. The drama had migrated elsewhere into conference rooms, court filings, whispered alliances. I was yesterday's crisis. A solved problem. That, I discovered, is when the real reckoning starts. Elena wheeled in a small whiteboard and propped it near the bed. Discharge planning. Physical therapy. Dietary recommendations that assumed I planned to live forever but joyously. You'll be out of here soon, she said. That's unfortunate, I replied. I was just getting good at lying down. She smiled, then hesitated. People are still calling, asking if they can see you. Are they asking as people, I said, or as beneficiaries? She didn't answer. Professionals rarely do when the truth is impolite. Midday brought an unexpected guest. Not family, not legal, not romantic, a journalist. He introduced himself with the careful humility of a man who knew my publicist would normally eat him alive. But my publicist thought I was dead, or worse, irrelevant. I'm not here to interview you, he said. I'm here because you asked. I did. He produced an email, sent years ago, from an address I barely remembered creating. Anonymous. Deliberate. In it, I had requested that if my will ever activated under unusual circumstances, He should come, observe, document, wait. You hired a witness, he said. I hired accountability, I corrected. He stayed for an hour. He didn't ask about money. He asked about silence. About how many dinners I'd missed. About whether I thought legacy was something you leave or something you live. I didn't like him. That's how I knew he was good. After he left, Margaret called. Not a visit. A call. That mattered. I've been thinking, she said. About the year. The exile. I asked, yes. The disappearing act. I was always better at exits than entrances. She laughed softly. You were terrible at both. She told me she wouldn't be around much longer. Not because she was angry. Because she had learned the cost of proximity to unfinished men. I don't want to be your lesson, she said. I want to be your proof. Of what? That change doesn't require witnesses. That night, I dreamed not of money. Not of deals. Of a kitchen I once owned and never used. Of a woman humming while washing dishes. Of me, younger, checking my phone instead of the room. I woke up furious at myself and oddly grateful. The next morning, I asked for my clothes. They arrived in a garment bag. Pressed and expensive, and completely inappropriate for the man I was becoming. I wore them anyway. Old habits deserve a dignified farewell. In the hallway, people watched me walk. Some with curiosity. Some with resentment. Some with relief. From their perspective, a dead man was leaving the building. Outside, the air felt illegal and regulated. It didn't care who I was. The driver waited by the curb. My car, my rules. I hesitated. Then I did something reckless. I sent the driver away. I walked instead, slowly, badly, free. With each step, I felt the weight of my name loosen. The city didn't recognize me without context. I was just an old man with a cautious gait and a very expensive coat. I passed a cafe. Almost went in. Didn't. I passed a bookstore. Went in. Inside, no one looked up. No one cared. I stood between shelves and laughed quietly to myself. This was what anonymity felt like, not loneliness. Possibility. By the time I returned to my temporary apartment, neutral, rented, anonymous, I was exhausted in a way that felt earned. On the table waited a folder. The trust. The rules. The year. I signed nothing. I closed it. For the first time in my life. I didn't want the structure yet. I wanted the silence. And somewhere, far from courtrooms and hospital beds, my fortune continued to argue over my absence while I practiced being present badly, clumsily, honestly for the very first time. The sixth day taught me something I should have learned decades earlier. Freedom is loud at first. The apartment echoed with it. No assistance. No calendar alerts barking orders. No urgent messages disguised as concern. Just space. And the unsettling realization that I didn't know how to fill it without spending money or issuing commands. I woke up early, out of habit, and immediately resented myself for it. The city, outside my window, moved with no regard for my schedule. People went to work, to love, to mistakes. None of them asked my permission. It was insulting and refreshing in equal measure. I made my own breakfast, burned it, ate it anyway. Achievement unlocked. Mid-morning, my phone buzzed. One notification. Claire. They're circling, she wrote. The board. The press. They think you're unstable. I smiled. For once, they weren't wrong. I typed back, good. Let them underestimate me for something other than greed. She didn't reply. I spent the afternoon walking. Not shopping. Not being escorted. Just walking until my knees complained and my thoughts caught up with me. That's when I saw her. Margaret stood outside a small gallery, arguing with a man half her age about lighting. She looked alive in a way she never had when she was with me. That stung. It was supposed to. I almost kept walking. Instead, I stopped. She noticed me, sighed, then smiled despite herself. You're terrible at disappearing. I'm in training, I said. We went for coffee. Not a power lunch. Not a dramatic reconciliation. Coffee and chip mugs that didn't care who I used to be. She told me she was leaving town. Teaching abroad. 6 months. Maybe more. Running away. I asked. Running toward, she corrected. I nodded. I always admired that about you. You always admired things you didn't imitate. She said. Fair. She didn't ask me to come. That mattered more than an invitation. When we parted, she kissed my cheek. Not forgiveness. Closure. In the evening, I received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a photograph. Me, younger, laughing, with a woman I didn't recognize at first. Then I did. Laura. Michael single quotes as mother. On the back, in her handwriting, you were happiest before you learned how to measure everything. That night, I called Michael. We talked awkwardly, honestly, about music. About the things we liked that had nothing to do with ambition. I don't need anything from you, he said. I just didn't want you to disappear without knowing me. I've made a career out of that, I replied. We agreed to meet again. No agenda. No contracts. After the call, I sat in the dark and thought about the women in my life. How each had offered me a version of love that required less performance and more presence. I had rejected all of them for the same reason. I didn't know how to be ordinary without feeling obsolete. The next morning, the journalists found me anyway. Not outside my building. Inside a grocery store. One recognized me by my face, stripped of context. That impressed me. Double quotes. Mr. Hale, he said, do you regret the wool? I looked at the produce section. Tomatoes arranged with more care than most of my relationships. I regret thinking I could solve love with a document, I said. He scribbled furiously. Is this a rebrand? He asked. I smiled. No, it's a breakdown. He laughed, and sure whether I was joking. I paid for my groceries with cash. It felt criminal. Back home, I cooked again. Better this time. As I ate alone, I realized something unsettling. I missed being needed. Not admired. Not feared. Needed. And that hunger, I suspected, would be the most dangerous thing I'd face yet, because it could easily drag me back to the very life I was trying to leave behind. The year hadn't even started, and already it was testing whether I wanted redemption or relevance. The seventh day arrived disguised as a favor. It began with a phone call I almost ignored. A known number, persistent, confident, the kind of call that assumes you still belong to it. I let it ring 3 times longer than necessary. Small rebellions matter when you're learning new habits. Mr. Hale, a familiar voice said when I answered. The tall lawyer. We need you. No, I replied calmly. You want me? Silence. Then a sigh. The distinction feels academic. I leaned back on the couch and stared at the ceiling. It had a crack I hadn't noticed before. A thin, branching line, like a decision that had once seemed small. What's broken? I asked. Everything, he said, with admirable honesty. Your absence created a vacuum. The board is split. Your brother is maneuvering. There's talk of an injunction to force your return as acting authority. I'm legally dead, I reminded him. Yes, he said, but inconveniently influential. I almost left. Influence was the one thing I hadn't managed to kill. I'll think about it, I said, and hung up before he could negotiate my thinking. An hour later, Richard showed up. No warning. No call. Just my brother standing in my living room like he'd always owned it. You look smaller, he said. You look the same, I replied. That's not a compliment. He didn't sit. Richard never sits unless there's leverage nearby. They're tearing it apart, he said. The company. Your legacy. The thing you built. I didn't build it alone, I said. No, he agreed. You built it to need you. That landed harder than I expected. He leaned forward. Come back. Fix this. Then you can go have your existential vacation. I studied his face. The familiar impatience. The resentment he'd worn since childhood, polished into professionalism. You don't want me back, I said. You want me useful. He smiled thinly. Same thing. When he left, the apartment felt polluted. That afternoon, I met Claire. Not at an office. Not at home. On a park bench that had seen better decades. You should go back, she said without preamble. That was fast. I'm not saying it for them, she continued. I'm saying it for you. I waited. You're running, she said. Not healing, I nodded. Both can be true, she sighed. You taught me that leadership means showing up when it's uncomfortable. I taught you many bad things. You taught me this one well. We sat in silence, watching a man teach his daughter how to ride a bike. He ran alongside her, one hand hovering near the seat, terrified and proud in equal measure. I never did that, I said. No, she replied. You hired someone who did. That evening, I opened the folder again. The trust. The year. The exile. I read the fine print I'd avoided before. The conditions. The penalties. The escape clauses I'd hidden from myself. There it was. I could return. Temporarily. Publicly. But only if I relinquished something permanent in exchange. Voting control. Final say. Delusion of indispensability. Past me had been thorough. I poured a drink. Stared at it. Poured it down the sink instead. Progress comes in humiliating forms. Late at night, Margaret sent a message. I heard about the chaos. It read, don't confuse responsibility with rescue. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that to. In the end, I said nothing, because for the first time, I understood what she meant. I wasn't required to save the machine I had built to replace me. I slept poorly, dreamed of boardrooms with no doors, of applause that echoed long after the room emptied. of myself standing at the head of a table, speaking, while no one listened. In the morning, I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not a speech-worthy one. A clean one. I would go back, not as king. Not as savior. As proof. Proof that the company could survive without my grip around its throat. Proof that leadership wasn't possession. Proof that love, when it's real, doesn't need leverage. I called the lawyer. I'll return, I said. Under the trust terms. He exhaled audibly. Thank God. For a week, I added. Then I disappear again. Permanently. He hesitated. They won't like that. I'm done being liked, I said. I'm interested in being finished. When the call ended, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief. Alignment. The dead man was going back to work. Not to reclaim his throne, but to dismantle it. Piece by careful piece. Before it finished dismantling everyone else. The 8th day didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a checkout line. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered it. Glass, steel, silence pretending to be respect. People stood when I entered. Old reflexes die hard. I told them to sit. Some obeyed. Some waited to see if I meant it. I did. From their perspective, I looked the same. Older, thinner, recently resurrected, but familiar enough to project expectations onto. They expected a speech, a correction, a reclamation. They got none of that. I spoke briefly. That was new. I confirmed my return under the trust's conditions. Temporary authority, clear limits, an expiration date no one could negotiate away. Faces tightened. Then I did the one thing they hadn't prepared for. I delegated myself out of relevance. I named successors. Not loyalists, competent people who had quietly kept the machine running while I pretended to be indispensable. I gave up voting control, publicly, irrevocably. I framed it as stability. They understood it as abdication. Richard didn't hide his shock. Claire didn't hide her pride. The meeting ended early. That terrified them more than any hostile takeover ever had. Outside, reporters waited. Microphones extended like weapons that pretended to be curious. Mr. Hale, someone shouted. Why give up control now? I smiled. Because control is a young man's addiction. I'm in recovery. They laughed. I meant it anyway. That afternoon, I packed my office. 30 years reduced to boxes of awards I didn't remember earning, and photos I barely remembered posing for. I kept one thing, a framed note written by Claire when she was 8. You work too much, it read. But I love you anyway. I put it back on the shelf. For someone else. That evening, I met Michael for dinner. No reservations. No statements. Just food and conversation, and the uncomfortable joy of discovering who someone is when you stop performing. I don't know what you want from me, I told him. He shrugged. Then you're finally being honest. Later, I walked alone. No driver. No schedule. Just the city. Doing what it does best, moving on without permission. I passed the hospital. For a moment, I considered going in. Thanking someone. Elena, maybe. But I didn't. Some chapters don't need revisiting to be complete. At home, the apartment was quiet. The good kind. I opened the last envelope I'd been avoiding. Margaret's handwriting. I won't pretend we could have worked, it said. But I'm glad you finally stopped pretending to. Live gently. You were never built for conquests. I sat with that for a long time. The next morning, I left. No announcement. No press. No dramatic disappearance. I turned off the phone, handed over the keys, and boarded a plane under a name that wasn't worth Googling, somewhere between takeoff and altitude. It hit me. I wasn't afraid of dying anymore. Not because I'd made peace with my legacy, but because I'd finally made room for my life. I had betrayed love once by postponing it. This time, I chose not to. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like something I needed to control, just something I was allowed to enter, quietly, honestly, and on my own terms.